Welcome to the Crypto Compliance Podcast by Gatenox.
This is Crypto Compliance by Gatenox, where compliance experts and practitioners are talking about current market events and general compliance aspects. My name is Paweł Kuskowski and I'm hosting this show. Today, we have a special guest, Bill Mew. Bill Mew is a high-profile opinion leader that campaigns for striking the right balance between meaningful protection of civil liberties like digital privacy and security and maximizing economic and social value. Bill led a big-profile case against Facebook that turned out to be not only against Facebook itself, but also Irish government and regulators who benefited from this big corporate. In this episode, we spoke also about the most important battle that we have in our lifetime, which is protecting privacy and personal data. We spoke also about whether big tech will be the owner of our privacy and data in the future, why it's almost impossible to stop this process, how governments, regulators, and court are cooperating with big tech. In crypto compliance, we promote the highest compliance standards in crypto and Web3, bringing interesting topics and talk about practical issues. I would like to ask you to subscribe to our YouTube channel, leave your comment and share it. Let's together promote compliance culture in crypto and Web3. We also invite you to our Spotify channel. This podcast is sponsored by Gatenox. Gatenox is the fast, network, and tailored corporate KYC solution. With Gatenox, you can onboard corporate clients by working in a trusted and compliant ecosystem with Web3 capabilities. Please also check our website, gatenox.com. Hi, Bill. Pleasure to have you on our Crypto Compliance podcast. If we can start, talking about you. We met together in Cambridge on the Financial Crime Symposium, and for me it was eye opener when I listened to you, and so many things which I heard is close to my heart, which is talking about privacy, talking about data protection, talking about big tech and how it influences our people, and what's the future brings with this. So over to you, Bill. Welcome.
Hi, nice to see you. And Cambridge was a great event. There were some really great minds there, and I enjoyed it interacting. But some of the issues I raised are of major concern to me. I tend to describe myself as either a troublemaker or a troubleshooter, depending on your perspective. If your global business model is exploiting our data and exploiting our privacy, and the company name might begin with F or G, then I'm definitely a troublemaker, and I've helped support campaigners like Max Schrems in Europe in the way he brought Facebook to account and took them to the European High Court and got them fined $1 billion, the largest fine ever. And I've led a lot of the campaigning in the UK, and I was shortlisted for Privacy Champion of the Year last year. And I do a lot of that in terms of calling things out in the media, on television, radio, where I appear a lot. But on the other side of the coin, if you're a company that is the unfortunate victim of cybercrime, then I'm not only a troubleshooter, but I'm probably the first person you could possibly call, because I'm the global cyber ambassador for an international association called the International Association of Risk and Crisis Communications, IARC.org. And we deal with a lot of the big challenges facing the world. I mean, I've got some colleagues on the board of IARC who are focused on health risk and have been supporting the World Health Organization through COVID and monkeypox. I've got other colleagues on the board looking at climate risk and financial risk. And my focus, I'm the global lead for cyber and looking at the cyber threat here. And I think all of us need to be concerned in terms of data protection, our privacy, and the way in which things are changing. And maybe that should be the thing we need to dive into in terms of our discussion.
Yes, and I think this is something very close to our audience. The aspect where big corporates or governments are, having a lot of information about us, and what you can use against us, or what you can use in order for, our, let's say, rights to be impacted negatively, by this type of approach. But at the same time, when you think about it longer term, in your opinion, is there any option that it will not happen in the sense that...
First of all, I think we need to define what we mean by privacy and what we think is reasonable in privacy terms. And therefore, there's an enormous amount of data about us that is incredibly private. And one of my roles, I was the head strategist for a cloud computing firm in the UK, which was once the fastest growing privately held tech firm in Europe called UK Cloud. And we hosted data like people's financial records for the tax authority in the UK, their health records, their criminal records, their driving records, all on behalf of the UK government, some of the most sensitive data. But it gives you an insight into the sort of information that governments do have on you. And to a large extent, by law, you have to share data with the government. If you're going to be part of a health system in your country, and some countries have more of a national health service and some have more of a private healthcare, but you need health records stored on your behalf so that they know what your illness is and your state of health is so that doctors can treat you properly. You need to have financial records that you share with the government so they can tax you appropriately. You need to have a driving record, so they've got a record of your driving license, your passport and things like that, so you can travel, so you can drive. So you need to understand that whilst we all want privacy, there is a certain amount of information that the government needs to hold on you as a matter of course in order for society to function correctly. Now, that doesn't mean that they need to have information about every call we make, every post we make, every conversation we have. That's where we stray into mass surveillance. And also we need to say, well, who does the government share that information? You trust the government with that. And then who else is collecting this sort of information? And there are some private firms out there collecting a wealth of information on us.
And I think, the government aspect is important, and I think, there is a lot of, let's say, hesitancy around, especially in our, crypto and, Web3 ecosystem, but what you share. And there's big discussion about Wordcoin, right? Wordcoin is, I don't know if you're familiar with the project, but effectively, it's a token associated with your retina, right? So something that is very private and, over time is supposed to be used to your, let's say, if you log into the system, you simply do your eye scan. Again, there are some very private information, some of which I've described. There's a lot of personal information about us and our role and our preferences in society, and that may have something to do with our political leanings, our sexual orientation, some of the associations and the friendships we keep, the private communications we have, all of which we would want to be kept private. But we also need to think that there are going to be financial transactions that we do as well, some of which we would want to keep private, but some of which actually, unfortunately, the government needs to know about, because unless there is a certain amount of oversight, there's going to be an enormous amount of tax avoidance and people using a lot of the privacy for the wrong reasons. Now, for society to function perfectly, we need the government to be effective in collecting tax, and that's one of its main driving functions. Certainly in the UK, HMRC, which is the Revenue and Customs, are enormously well funded by the government and hold an enormous amount of data on us. And actually, it would be scary if you knew the way in which they would be able to triangulate your financial situation from property records, from payment records, from all sorts of different things. So if you return a tax form that is wildly out of line with the information that they hold on you, it's going to ring alarm bells and you're going to be inviting trouble. And if you're going to embark on a complete tax avoidance and try and use encryption and privacy as a means of doing so, then you're running up against these guys, and ultimately they have the law on their side.
Also, if you're going to commit crime, there is a derogation within GDPR where there's a lot of private information that's held and kept, and we're not allowed to have sort of mass surveillance. But the derogation under GDPR for law enforcement means that if they get a warrant from a judge, and it has to be from proper independent judicial supervision, then they can get a warrant to see some of your data, a bit like you get a warrant for a wiretap on a phone line or whatever. And that is the way it works. But it needs to have independent judicial oversight. It needs to have the right of redress. It needs to have an appeals process. Those are some of the protections that need to be embedded. Now, one of the unfortunate things, and we've seen in the fine against Facebook and in the overturning of the data sharing treaty with America, a slight exposure of the fact that there is a very different orientation in the UK and Europe from what exists in the US. Here in Europe, we see privacy as an absolute human right, and we're very adamant about that, and we have led the world with GDPR in that respect. In America, they're far more focused on national security, and the NSA and a lot of the organizations, they can issue secret warrants, which actually are entirely counter to GDPR because there's not adequate judicial supervision. They're not adequately targeted. There's a lot of mass surveillance going on, and there's no redress or appeals process. And therefore, it falls foul of what we would regard as the adequate safeguards. And it's for that reason that a lot of people have real issues with some of the mass surveillance that is conducted by the American authorities. The unfortunate fact is that laws in America exist that allow them to tap in at will to all of the networks where much of our data is held. So that includes Facebook or Twitter or all of the social platforms. It includes all the cloud platforms, Amazon, Microsoft, Google. It includes all the telcos. It includes any cloud firms which operate software as a service. So any of what are defined as communications service providers. Bill,
don't you have any? I mean, don't you have this kind of thinking in your mind that that's effectively? And I know that I put you in the position that you're almost like defending the government. I don't want you put.
I'm not defending the government. I'm one of the people.
I know exactly. You know,
and therefore I've been one of the main champions and the campaigners challenging this because I think this is wrong. And I think the laws as they're set out in the US overstep the border, because effectively what can happen in the US is if the NSA or one of the authorities there want to surveil you, they will serve a warrant, a secret warrant on one of these companies. It could be Facebook, it could be Amazon, and they will secretly obtain your data. Now, the nature of the secret warrant means that, first of all, they don't have adequate judicial supervision when they're getting the warrants in the first place. They're kept secret. The company they're served on, Facebook or Amazon, whoever, are not allowed to tell you that you've been subject to such a warrant, and there is no redress process. There's no right of appeal. There's no protections whatsoever. What is more is that these are extraterritorial in nature, because there's another law in America called the Cloud Act, which means that even if that data is held on a server in Europe or the UK, they can still get hold of it, because the organization, whatever tech firm it is obliged to transfer the information to America, and it sees there, which is actually a rather distorted view on the legal jurisdiction, because they don't have legal jurisdiction in Europe. They wouldn't be able to seize the data here under GDPR. So they get around it by just telling the company to transfer it to America and then seizing it there. And therefore, all of our data is at risk of seizure at any time through this secret warrant process by the NSA or any of the organizations in America.
Where, in your opinion, is the level? Because there are two interests which are conflicting, right? There's the society versus individual, right? And I think, we Europeans are quite focused on individual aspect. If you would see this from China perspective.
Except that the society has an interest in protecting our rights because we have chosen that's how we want to run our societies. And now a lot of people will say, well, why would I need to have the right of privacy if I've done nothing wrong? I've got nothing to hide. Well, it was the same as saying, why would I need freedom of speech if I've got nothing to say? There are a lot of people out there actually saying some very important things on your behalf. And actually these rights are very important. So yes, all of these rights need to exist and we need to protect them with as much vigor as we can. And there's the unfortunate thing here is the governments aren't protecting our rights. The regulators aren't protecting our rights. The police authorities aren't protecting our rights. It's down to a group of fairly vocal, well-motivated campaigners such as myself that have actually been out there challenging these big tech firms. In the case of Max Schrems, taking them all the way to the European High Court and getting them confirmed or getting them fined. And this was very much, not only was we not assisted in any way by the data regulators who are meant to be there to protect our rights, we were actually hampered by the Irish data regulator because it didn't want us to be challenging Facebook and others in this way. And therefore, the big concern here is that as a society, who is out there to protect us?
Exactly. So there's no court where you can, in order to go to court, you need to properly understand, what rights.
Well, the situation, and the Facebook example is a really good one to focus on because Facebook, a bit like all of the other big tech firms, has its headquarters in Ireland. And Ireland is very keen to attract all these firms for tax reasons. They offer a very favourable corporate tax regime. They also offer a very favourable regulatory regime because they think that will attract you. And therefore, they don't want to rock the boat. So that when we brought a case against Facebook, the Irish regulator actually challenged us for doing so. And we actually had to overcome the obstruction by the Irish regulator, take it all the way to the highest court in Europe and to win. But even after the case had been won, the ruling should have been enforced the very next day. But it wasn't. It wasn't a change in the law. It was just the fact that Facebook had been found to be breaking the law. And therefore the ruling should have been enforced. But the Irish regulator didn't, and it dragged its heels. We then had to campaign very heavily, and Max and his team managed to get a vote in the European Parliament of 541 votes to 1 in order to sanction the Irish for not taking steps. And even then, the Irish regulator was colluding with Facebook on a workaround so they could get out of it by just saying, well, actually, when you sign up to Facebook, you're entering into a contract, and in that contract, we can do away with your rights. Well, I'm sorry, but under GDPR, you cannot sign your rights away like that. If the Irish regulator in cahoots with Facebook came together with an agreement like this, it would undermine GDPR overnight and everyone's privacy would be lost. And for the very fact that the Irish regulator was colluding with Facebook rather than supporting the campaigners was a travesty. And the biggest irony was that we had to crowdfund all our expenses. We had to take it every step of the way with a lot of people acting pro bono. I was doing a lot of campaigning to help fundraise. And what we were trying to do was to hold Facebook to account. But when Facebook was fined $1 billion, that fine didn't come to the campaigners who brought the case. It went to the Irish regulator who'd been frustrating us every step of the way.
And what do you think? Why do you think that the government is so willing to cooperate with big tech or losing so badly with big tech?
Well, it comes on to the sort of topic that I was covering in Cambridge, and we're seeing an alteration in the balance of things. Initially, some time back, when we go back in history and we look at where things stood, there was a power balance which very much had the governments at the top of it, and the governments were the ones who held all of the power. This had been largely through the fact that they ran the courts and everything else, and taxation and everything that came with it. And in the presentation I gave, I talked about a triangle, and I'm going to share the graphic here with you. You may be able to share this later with your listeners, with the government at the top of the triangle, but with individuals and tech firms at the bottom, with the government very much setting the rules. Now, things have evolved since then, and we've seen a lot of change in the power balance. Back then, it was very much the fact that technology would be relatively well understood. Taxes and wages and corporate profits would all be easy to collect, and the regulation would no different from the tech sector than in any other industry. Globalization was such that I'm somebody who's gone from being a gamekeeper to being a poacher. I used to work for big tech. I was the global head of corporate communications for IBM's financial services sector. So I'm very familiar with the finance sector and a lot of the intricacies there. But when I worked for IBM, they had over 20,000 employees in the UK alone. And therefore, it was all of the countries benefited from the high skills, the high employment with the research labs they had here in the UK. And obviously, back then, questions around identity were not really a problem. But what we've seen is that things have evolved. And whereas once the governments held all the power, the technology firms have started to increase in terms of their perspective and their power. We've now got a really complicated environment where it's more and more difficult for the public and the politicians to understand the technology. Taxation starts to become more difficult as we have tax arbitrage, and we have, as we saw, a lot of the tech firms having their headquarters in Ireland. Regulation has become far more difficult because we're trying to crack down on what are becoming tech monopolies at the moment. And obviously, in this power dynamic, in the sort of globalization terms, America has remained dominant, but it's something that we've seen is the power has been concentrated in a small number of big tech firms. And if anything, this tech trend has started to increase, where the power shift has become even greater, with technology firms not only rivaling governments, but in many areas we're starting to see with the cloud era that the technology complexity has now increased to such a level that most of our politicians simply don't understand the technology anymore. Taxation has been distorted by a lot of business moving offshore and shifting profits in that way. Regulation has become stronger in terms of GDPR and other things, but some of the big companies are avoiding this. And the final phase that we're concerned about is the fact that we're entering a technopolar environment where actually the tech firms start to have far more power even than governments, and this means that they're above the law. And if we saw as our ability to chase Facebook through the courts, we're seeing that certainly with AI and other technologies coming down the line, we're going to have such complicated technologies that even people within the tech industry don't understand them. We're going to have taxation, a real problem here. We failed to tax cloud firms effectively because they've moved operations around to avoid tax. And Google and Amazon and others pay a limited amount of tax compared with their economic activity. But under AI, we're going to see jobs to a large extent automated in a way that we will going from people who had jobs that paid money and roles that paid tax and all of that work will be done by computers that aren't paying any tax and that can be cited anywhere in the world in order to cite them to avoid whatever taxes or to arbitrage. The regulation becomes more and more difficult for governments to employ, and certainly around the regulation in AI. If a lot of people in the industry don't understand how some of the AI models, how on earth are the regulators going to either understand it or keep up? And in terms of our identity, we're going to have a real problem then in the abuses that we're going to see continue, and that's going to be a problem that's going to go. They're going to carry on for years, and there are others. Such as Ian Bremmer have talked about the technopolar world, but from my perspective, I've got some real concerns here that we're starting to see some big technology companies that are largely above the law. They're not being held to account. We've also got some AI models that people don't understand and aren't going to be effectively regulated and are largely going to be acting beyond the arm of the law because we don't know how to regulate them. And then we've got some cyber criminals who are working from safe havens where rogue governments are allowing them to operate, where they are beyond the arm of the law. And this combination is of real concern to us.
And I think you mentioned about big tech being above the law. There is excellent book called The Age of Surveillance Capitalism by Shona Zuboff. And I remember reading this. I mean, there was a couple of years ago, right? The combination of money, lack of understanding on the court side and governance side, and lawyers who are engaged by this big tech. It's almost like it's calculated in the operations. Takes typically a couple of years to lose in the court if they lose. And then, at the same time, they make such a big amount of money that it's almost like you are not able to catch it.
Well, we experienced this very much in the challenge against Facebook led by Max, in the fact that we had to crowdfund our expenses. A lot of the legal team had to act pro bono, and we were taking on a company that had very deep pockets and a massive army of lawyers and did everything to frustrate us and had, so at certain points, the regulator on its side helping. And that made it very difficult. But nevertheless, we went all the way to the highest court in Europe and won. The problem is that it's not the law that was a problem, it's the enforcement. And I think we're going to start to see enforcement as becoming more and more of an issue. We've seen with GDPR that the law wasn't being effectively forced at all against the tech giants. Yeah. My question would be that if there are other data breaches or data abuses going on, if you're the subject of some sort of data abuse, what do? Do you turn to the police? Well, I mean, the police aren't going to do anything about it. They're struggling to crack down on normal crime, let alone the sort of really complex crime that they don't have the skills to deal with. Is the regulator going to do anything? Well, to a large extent, the regulator ignores most complaints and certainly doesn't do anything against some of the largest data abusers, which are the Facebook and the like. Who else is going to? The government? I mean, if it weren't for a handful of well-motivated campaigners, nobody would have held Facebook to account. And when it comes to AI, where it's a black box and you don't know what's going on inside, how on earth are you going to regulate that effectively? I mean, I think a lot of the companies in Asia have decided that it's almost impossible to regulate and that they're going to take a far more hands-off approach than I think the Europeans are planning. But if the Europeans do go down a fairly strict regulatory approach towards AI, how on earth are they going to enforce it? Because they're not enforcing some of the rules they've already got.
And I tell you, I think from my perspective, what I see is also the people who do not understand what's happening, and for a number of either using some services or using certain applications, like myself, and I'm trying not to use anything, right, in terms of Facebook or Instagram, but I am on X, on Twitter, I am on LinkedIn, so that's something and I'm, more and more kind of sharing the data, right? And then you have the applications, and it's almost like you will find your application when you start sharing your personal sensitive data.
Yeah, but then, okay, so
like health, application, right?
Yeah, it depends where you want. It depends where you want to draw the line. And okay,
yeah.
I'm happy to share my medical records with my doctor and others. I mean, I've been through bowel cancer recently, and if they didn't have all the accurate medical records, they wouldn't have been able to treat me accurately. I'm very happy to, and I have a Facebook account, I have a Twitter account, I have some Google accounts and other things, and I tend to try as much as possible to live the life of a typical citizen. I'm not trying to be a hermit. I'm not trying to be entirely anonymous.
So where do you draw the line? Where do you draw the line?
That's the whole thing. Yeah. From my perspective, I limit what I'm going to be sharing. Now, my political allegiance may well be understood. They may well understand if I have a particular sexual alignment or whatever. From my perspective, they may be able to calculate certain nuances, but if they're going to be sharing that information, if they're going to be surveilling some of my private communications, if they're going to be discriminating against me in a way that would be illegal, then they're overstepping the mark there. And the complaint that we had with the Americans when we were bringing the case against Facebook was not necessarily in terms of the fact that the national authorities in America needed to gain access to information for national security, because we support the need for national security. We support the need for adequate policing against child pornography or against online harms and bullying.
But if you have more, surveillance cameras in the UK than in China.
Absolutely. So right, the point that we made here was you need that, but it needs to be where it is truly warranted, where it's proportionate, where it's targeted, where there is adequate independent judicial oversight, where there is redress, where there's the right of appeal, where all of these protections are in place. Because data protection doesn't mean you letting nobody have any data. Data protection means that you sharing the information that you need to share, to live your life, to carry on. I mean, when I want to travel to America, I need to book a flight, I need to book a holiday, I need to possibly give my passport number, I need to give some details about myself, and I need to do that in order to be able to fly there, in order to complete a contract. So whenever I do those things, I need to. But if they're collecting data that is unnecessary, if there is a level of massive surveillance and intrusion, either by companies or by the legal authorities, that goes way beyond either what be warranted or what be necessary, and lacks the sort of safeguards in terms of judicial supervision, etc., then that's what we're challenging.
And in Cambridge, you touch on very interesting aspect, and I think something that it's again, close to the crypto and Web3 ecosystem is, that at some point your data will stop be your value or your, let's say, personal thing, but it's becoming the thing that you need to pay for your personal data, which is owned by big tech and big companies. So it's almost like tokenization of your personal data, which you didn't consent. And at some point, and it's happening, I say, we spoke about this before, but, it's happening. I see this in some European country, in Poland, for example, there is, in order for you to sign off on a number of documents, a number of, let's say, government access, you need to use bank account with limited, there's limited amount of banks. Not every bank is on this list. So you need to have specifically your, account with these banks who will share the data and you can sign off. It's very convenient in terms of UX, UI, but at the same time, it means that I need to have account with this bank. So I need to bring the money, I need to pay them, right? So it's almost like we already in this place where you need to pay for your data effectively.
Yeah, it's a fairly muddy water here because effectively we need to pay the government for the services they run. That's how taxation works, and how many health.
But it's private company, This is not like government.
I understand that, and increasingly a number of governments are working with private companies, and we're seeing private health companies, we're seeing private education, we're seeing a lot of private companies now. Where you draw the line, how a society goes down, that it's not necessarily for me to decide, but somebody needs to be holding people to account, so that if the government goes too far in sort of privatizing these things, then we need to be able to have an election to throw out this government and bring in a government that does it in a better way that we're actually happier with. From my perspective, I'm very much an activist, and I'm very outspoken, but I very much encourage people to be aware of their privacy, their rights and everything, and to vote accordingly, because the politicians that you get, the laws that you get, are the ones that you deserve. Because if you didn't vote against them, then you're part of the problem. So when we come and look at this, effectively, if we have too much privatization, the risk is that we end up handing our data over on either for free or under some obligation to private sector organizations that end up selling it back to us, and in the form of services. And therefore, the equation that is drawn in every single country between public and private and how this works is very much down to those organizations. And as long as we can protect democracy such that we have the right to push out a government that goes too far, just as we want to protect the judicial oversight so that we have an independent judiciary, and there are some countries that are cracking down on the independent judiciary, which is of great concern. These are the protections that we need to fight for. And when I say fight for it, we went through the courts, we took things as far as we could. I'm happy to champion, and I speak on the BBC and other television networks regularly, advocating a lot of the points that I'm making. But I peep, as individuals, we need to be aware of what's happening with our data, what's happening to our rights, and to vote accordingly and to make our opinions count.
I think, partially there is a problem also with society when, effectively, many of people would resign from their rights to be protected to, for some convenience. And I tell you, anecdote about this. We went, a couple of years ago, it was when crypto was like at the peak, there was big conference, but still early days of crypto. And we went down to Malta when there was like big event. And there was time when, people were coming still in the masks, like anonymous, guys coming to the conference, paying in crypto, all this stuff. There was like huge event, like hundreds of people. After there was after party, right? And after party was next door in casino, right? So everyone rushed to the casino. And then, in order to enter the casino, you had to hand over your document, right? Passport or identity card, and actually the same people who were just like half an hour ago, very anonymous, like they didn't want to share any data, including the face, like then they all went off because there was free beer inside the casino. There was some party going on in the casino, and they were handing over documents. It was like big crowd, the same people, So I said, like, that's crazy. This is like you almost find some application, some service where you're gonna give up your privacy, and I don't think it's actually. I think that the business, the big tech, it's there to win, and it's very difficult to stop for individuals because we just simply are constructed in this way.
Well, I think there's a generational shift that I'm concerned about, in the fact that I've got a little bit of grey hair, and I've been around a while. I've got children of my own. I remember there being a lot of votes in the UK Parliament against us having an ID card. And that we didn't want to have an ID card in this country because we felt that it would result in mass surveillance. Now, the thing is that with facial recognition, your face ends up being your ID card. You're just wandering around and you're being spotted wherever you go anyway. And there are not enough people who are up in arms about this or are aware of their digital rights. And in fact, with the younger generation, what I see is that they're all too quick to sign away their privacy or to give away their information. But if the Wi-Fi goes down and they're not able to get online, they're up in arms. I mean, they're horrified. Yeah. So there are things that get them animated. That's not always the right things. And certainly with some of these biometrics, I think we need to be concerned because while you can reset a password or an identity that you have online, you can't reset your face, you can't reset your fingerprints, you can't reset your DNA. And then therefore, if people are collecting fingerprints, DNA, things like that, and for some reason that is put together with a lot of other information with you, and then the biometric identifiers are lost or breached in some way, then you're at risk of identity theft for the rest of your life, because you're going to have the same fingerprints and the same DNA to the day you die. So there are some real concerns there, and I think people make far too light of what information they give away.
Yeah, but I tell you, another example. I was a couple of months ago in Thailand with my family, right? And when you go through the border, you land, in Thailand, and you go through the border. In order to go through the border, you need to give your fingerprints, and you need to they're gonna scan your retina. So that's something that, in my mind, is, if we share this type of data, I'm 100% sure there will be leak at some point, and your data will be available, right? If you have, and you go through this process, over and over, nobody's asking you to, can you consent to this, to this disclosure? Do you agree? Are you fine with this? No, you have a choice to stay at the airport, right? Or you actually have to go through this. So there's no choice actually left to you as an individual. And then, it's almost like, it's from the legal perspective, then it's actually almost playing the opposite side. So right now, I think in court, you can go, and if someone would tell you that was you, because there was your fingerprint, there's like your scan of your face, and then you can say like, listen, this was available, you can fake it, and I can show you how to fake it, right?
Yeah, but there are far bigger problems here, right, in the fact that there have been a lot of court cases where people have assumed that data records are infallible. And there's a very famous case in the UK against a lot of people in the post offices here, where a computer system accused a lot of them of fraud, and it was later found that the records on which the cases were brought were flawed, and that they weren't liable of fraud, but a lot of lives were ruined. And there are some major challenges at the moment on the validity of data that they hold on you. For example, if you've got an iPhone, as I do, and you have facial recognition or fingerprint recognition on these type of devices, the sort of facial recognition and the fingerprint recognition that they have is very crude. And it's not absolute, but there have been cases of people saying, well, that is proof that you logged into this and therefore you made this transaction or whatever. And there are starting to be test cases at the moment where people are challenging that, because not only can people obtain some of these biometric identifiers and fake them, but also they're not infallible. I mean, you can have twins that look very alike, or you can have ways in which the identification is mistaken. And I've known some of these facial recognition or thumb recognition systems actually mistakenly allow people the wrong access, and that's even without somebody going to the effort of faking your identity.
Yeah, and then when you think about the let's say identity in the from the technology perspective, then you have a question of what can be done against you, or to kind of steer your, let's say, thinking. And then we have all this big tech aspect, when actually the ads which it's almost like I know what my wife is, right now reviewing, because I'm actually right now, or what she's trying, want to buy, because I have this type of ads right now on my phone, right? So the connection is, almost immediate, and same for her. She understands.
There's enormous amount of tracking and information
Exactly.
and held on us, and one of the things of concern is there are hotels, there are retailers, there are casinos out there with facial recognition systems that are really quite advanced, where you're not actually giving your consent to any of that. Yeah. And they're still tracking you. Beyond that, you need to start to think about, well, what would you do if you challenge something? So if there is an app where you've made a payment or done a transaction based on some sort of flawed biometric access, and they say, well, it's got to be you. We're going to take this money from you because you did the transaction. When you protest, you couldn't. You're going to find it very difficult to prove your innocence, because it is assumed that a lot of the systems that they have in place are infallible.
And what do you think there is a way to stop it, except like really hard work and maybe tons of lawyers who suddenly wake up to the we're gonna do pro bono work for next 10 years to actually recover this?
Well, we've even the problem. There isn't even in some places the means of actually applying the law that we have now. Obviously, in the EU, we have GDPR and
but the GDPR is, in my opinion, is dead. Almost. Well,
there are some things you can go to a company and you can ask for your data record to be provided, or you can exercise the right to be forgotten. And if they don't do that, then you can file a complaint with the regulator. And normally the companies will apply because they don't want the headache. And if there's a massive data breach, then you can bring a class action suit against a company, and companies are really quite scared of that sort of thing. It's not as good in other parts of the world where they don't have that protection. And even in the UK, where only a short while ago we were part of the EU, we don't have any means of bringing a case for data breach, because there have been that we don't have. In America, they have a class action arrangement where they're an incredibly litigious society, and they're forever bringing cases for one thing or another. In Europe, they have what is a fairly basic means of bringing a class action suit. In the UK, we have what's called a representative action. So representative action means everyone can be represented by a single claimant if they all have the same claim. Well, that's very good, but unfortunately, when there was a major claim against Google not long ago, Google had actually done a workaround on the iPhone, which was a horrendous breach of everybody's privacy. However, when it got to court, Google's argument was, actually, we may have breached your privacy, but we didn't do it equally. Therefore, you can't bring a representative action against us, because you're not all making the same claim. And the requirement for a representative action is we all have to be being the same claim. So Google won on that ground, not claiming to be innocent. And then there was a follow-up ruling where there's a group called Carphone Warehouse, or DSG, the Dixons, where they sell technology, a big chain of stores, and they had a major breach, and a claim was sought to bring against them, and the judge in the case said, well, I'm going to ignore any claims for distress and inconvenience and anything like that. We'll just bring it simply down to the Data Protection Act, which is our version of GDPR. And he said, well, that claim is very, very simple. It can be brought in the county court, which is the lower level court. But unfortunately, you can't reclaim costs in the lower courts, in the county courts in this country. And therefore, you can't bring a representative action, because if you're going to bring a case for on behalf of 1 million people or whatever, it only makes sense if you can reclaim the costs of all of the sort of work behind bringing such a large claim. And therefore, effectively, on the basis of those two rulings, not only is it almost impossible to bring a case, but you wouldn't be able to get your costs repaid. So it would be completely uneconomic. And therefore, there are almost no representative actions being brought in the UK of any kind for any form of data abuse. And we have no means of doing that. And I've raised this in Parliament, and I've sought to address this to politicians because it means that effectively we have next to no rights. At least in Europe, you can bring a class action suit. In America, they do it all the time.
But like for example, in Europe, you have to prove, your loss or what actually was.
At least you can bring the case, and then that gives you a chance.
Yeah, yeah. But then like, what's the reason to do this? Like to fix the terms and conditions of the service provider. That's to a large
extent. Look, if things are working well, then the regulator would be holding companies to account on our behalf.
Yeah.
People like Max Schrems, myself, we wouldn't need to be out there campaigning on everyone's behalf because there would be adequate enforcement. It goes back to the fact that we're not enforcing the regulations that we have effectively, and therefore there's widespread abuse. In fact, the problem that we have is even before GDPR was introduced, there were data protection laws. And responsible companies were acting responsibly with our data even before GDPR. And irresponsible companies weren't. Now we've introduced GDPR. Responsible companies are still complying, but they're doing a lot more to comply because and incurring a lot more costs in their compliance. The irresponsible companies that weren't going to abide by the rules still aren't doing, and they're gaining even more of a competitive advantage by not having that cost of compliance on them, and then they've got little fear of being brought to account or being held to account.
No, that's exactly, next point is how you actually ensure that you're promoting the good guys and, you don't follow the wrong guys because economically it's a huge cost to maintain and create everything. It's not only cost to do this, but
GDPR brought in rules that made it more rigorous in terms of compliance and therefore more costly. And unless the rules are enforced, it just means that the competitive advantage in not doing the right thing become greater.
So it looks our cause of protecting privacy is only in the hands of technologies who actually building something around protection. Is there any technological way to, in your opinion, or do you see anyone who is coming close to, I don't know, mesh network?
There are initiatives, and Tim Berners-Lee and various other leading technologists have talked for some time about a different approach to protecting our data, where it's tokenized and there are different access rights to, and we own our own data. I think to a large extent, the ship has sailed on that one, and most of our data is out there already. On top of that, the vested interests from the technology firms and the other major players are against that. And if there isn't much political drive to enforce the current rules effectively, there's not going to be particularly a great deal of political impetus to actually do something more complicated if that were to arise. So I'm not holding my breath on that. I would like to see something like that, obviously, but in terms of being someone who has the weary experience of what all of this is like. I mean, Max has brought a couple of cases against Facebook now, and in the process has overturned Safe Harbor and Privacy Shield, the two data sharing agreements with the US. This hasn't forced the US to change its policy in any way. It's complicated by the fact that there's largely chaos in Congress at this very moment in time, but there has been gridlock for a long time now, and they failed to enact any sort of federal privacy legislation in the US. Various different states have brought forward regulations, and it's sort of a patchwork arrangement of different states with slightly different regulations, which just adds to the complexity. But if they eventually were able to overcome the gridlock and bring a federal privacy law in the US, it will be hard enough for them to do that. I don't think they go the extra mile by including measures to address some of the concerns that the pesky Europeans have about sort of silly things like judicial independence and the right to redress and other things like that, because I think they'd struggle to get anything through law and wouldn't be bending over backwards to keep us happy.
And what, from your conversation, what's the percentage of society who is concerned actually with anything related to privacy?
Depends. I mean, certainly the younger generation, you see that there tend to be polar opposites. There are some that are very animated by all of this, but the vast majority are completely unconcerned. And again, more concerned if the Wi-Fi goes out and they can't get online than they are sort of handing information over on a willy-nilly and posting far too much information on social media.
And what drives you? I mean, what happened, that you actually moved from IBM to, to be this campaigner for privacy?
Well, I to a large extent, I started working for a company called UK Cloud, who were responsible for hosting some of the most sensitive workloads that the government has for us. I then became very aware that those workloads could be held with Amazon or Google or Microsoft or one of the US cloud giants, in which case the NSA and other authorities would have access to it fairly willy-nilly at their behest. Or it could be safeguarded and held far more securely, so we were given a higher level of data protection. And even then, I'm not sure that those government entities that do actually keep data in local service providers in these jurisdictions actually do enough to protect the data. We're still seeing data breaches far too frequently, or are sensible enough about when and how they share it. And that goes back to your concerns about private sector entities having our data. And therefore, we need voices out there. I'm one of them, holding these organizations, be they governments, be them large tech firms, be them whoever else, to account and to make as much noise about some of our concerns as possible.
Yeah, I think, in general, we need to make as much noise as possible, because this is something that it's so frightening, like, I think like it's such a important topic, and it's going to be more and more important, and there's not enough, this is not being discussed almost at all, in the, I don't know, at home or in TV. I mean, you're doing great. I think
the general level of awareness is poor. But I mean, I think governments are now partly being rallied, partly, I mean, the ironic thing is, I don't think the governments care a great deal about us and our data. What the governments are more concerned is taxation and the fact that they're going to be losing out heavily, because they're not going to be able to make ends meet if the technology firms are going to be allowed to continue to avoid paying their share of tax. And we've seen this with the cloud firms already, with a level of arbitrage between jurisdictions, with profits being moved into jurisdictions that are favorable or whatever. That was bad enough when it was just the cloud and the data or whatever. If with AI, if a lot of the means of creative production is suddenly automated and done in the cloud, such that jobs that were, as I said, once paying wages, paying taxes, are then automated and taken offline, suddenly we have a real problem. Because in any technological transformation or revolution we have. And we used to have typing pools where there are banks of ladies typing away, typing people's letters out or whatever, and all of that is gone. And I don't think anyone misses the typing pools or is asking for them to come back anytime soon. But those jobs were lost. But thankfully, they were replaced by other jobs. And in any transition, you always see three cohorts. You have a group of people who get it, and they're going to really thrive and grasp and exploit the technology, whatever it is. You have a middle group that could get it if they were given the right training or support or whatever. And then you have a final group who are never going to get it, and they're going to be left behind. And every time you have a transition, there's a group that are left behind. But what the hope is that the economic benefits generated by the people that get it will outweigh the economic costs of the people who won't get it. And therefore, one group ended up subsidizing or compensating the others through social benefits or whatever. The problem you have in the transition to AI, and everyone is up in arms about the loss of jobs, and I actually don't think that's the main problem. I think the number of jobs created may well balance the number of jobs not created. The far bigger problem is a enormous proportion of the work, the wealth creation, will no longer be done by people who have wages or who you can tax. And therefore, this will completely undermine the revenue and the tax take within the societies that we know today. And that puts the societies themselves at risk. And governments are starting to become a little bit animated about this, not because they're worried about our privacy or our data, they're worried about their tax revenue because they had to make ends meet. So I think we will see some action taken here. I think belatedly. I think regulation is always very slow and is a far too much of a lagging control. So we need to do something because, or completely rethink the way that we redistribute wealth and everything like that. Because we saw in different stages in history a balance between capital and labour, where at some points in time, labour and the vast majority of us work for a living. We toil and earn an income and hope that we can home and feed our families from it. Those who have capital are people who have invested wealth, and they actually have been above the rest of us for some time. But we may be moving to a society where previously a lot of the invested wealth has been in property and other things like that. But if suddenly a lot of the invested wealth in systems and a means of value creation through technology, so these vast technology giants start to own a large proportion of wealth creation, then I think we'll see distortions in our society, not only in the data that they hold, but in their power to manipulate data and to create value that can't be matched by you and I.
Yeah, I think that's another big topic which we can keep for a separate conversation. But I tell you, this is exactly what it's like. There are some major concerns which in crypto we talk almost constantly at the same time, not finding any solution. Bill, thank you very much. That was excellent. I really appreciate your time.
Well, I hope that's been interesting, because
it is.
The last thing I would want to do is not to be reasonably thought-provoking. So hopefully we've set a few minds racing about what they need to do about sort of being slightly more engaged and aware of their own personal data, and possibly have some concerns about what's happening in society.
Crypto Compliance, brought to you by Gatenox.